Everyone has been placed on mute. So we will address your questions at the end of each presentation this morning. And if you have questions for the presenters, please put them in the Q&A function. And if you want to talk with other participants in the meeting, you can use the chat. With that, I will turn the meeting over to Mike Gower.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It is late in the summer. I hope each of you have had an opportunity to get some rest and recharging time. I'm coming off a week last week at the beach with my kids and my grandkids, and very much enjoyed that, being offline mostly and having an opportunity to play in tidal pools and waves with my two little ones. And I note it's the beach, so it indicates I wasn't at the Jersey Shore. I was South Carolina. Clear distinction that I had to learn when I came to New Jersey. I'd like to review the agenda with you. We have an excellent program today, a lot of good information and introductions of some topics that I think will be helpful to you. Next slide, please. Whoops. Sorry. On the agenda, I'll give a little bit of an overview on trends in higher education, things that I'd like to do at each of these town halls, key topics, things that I'm thinking about, things that I've noticed in the higher education literature, if you will, and have some things to show you on that. After that, I'll be introducing topics on procurement policy. Maggie Quinn from Procurement Services will be giving an update on new policies that we have adopted, ones that I think will be helpful to each of you who are involved in the procurement process. Makes things easier, makes things more reliable. After that, we'll reintroduce to some of you Doug Horr. Doug is new to Rutgers as our chief audit executive, but he's returned to Rutgers after several years away at other institutions. He's going to be talking about embracing excellence, empowering change, and the overview of what his organization does and how it contributes to the health of the organization. And then last but not least, before Q&A, we'll be having David Moore, our Vice President, Chief Budget Officer, talking about the fiscal year 24 budget. So a lot of good information following Q&A, and the conclusion of this, we will be having a variety of Ask the Expert sessions available to you. So next slide, please. Next. One more. This is a view that came from a Deloitte document that talks about risk intelligent institutions. Institutions that are challenged but are working to remain healthy need to assess regularly their risk profile. What are the things in the horizon that are of danger? What are the risks? What are the things in the horizon that are opportunities, but may come with some risk? Risk management in higher education is a balance between those things that allow you to grow and develop and sustain through challenging times versus those being careful about risks that could be deadly or injurious to the organization. Enterprise risk management, which Doug will be referring to later on, along with the balance with internal audit and compliance, is a critical element of assessing our health as an organization, assessing our health as an institution. And we have reintroduced the enterprise risk management program to this university about a year and a half ago. And we'll be working through that, making it a regular part of our work. Enterprise risk management allows you to identify as an organization those things that are most concerning, either from the perspective of impact, likelihood, and to the degree to which an organization has mitigated those risks through one preparation or another. I think this is an important element of a healthy organization, as I referred, and we are hard at work at that. Next slide, please. Looking at the overview of colleges and universities is an important thing, and a number of organizations that help us look at the environment. This particular view comes from Moody's Investor Services. Moody's is the organization that assesses the credit worthiness of organizations, whether they be for-profit or not-for-profit, such as we are. And they have done a review of current issues and risks that are facing colleges and universities. And this really speaks to the things that I'm concerned about in terms of Rutgers and where we are positioned, what is happening to us coming out of the COVID pandemic, and also going into what has been referred to as enrollment cliff. There are a lot of things that are impacting higher education. These are 6 that were identified by Moody's. They do speak to me. There are things, a couple of which are involved with the federal government, one that's involved with state. At the lower risk end of things, federal dollars for research and student aid. That has been an area of opportunity and health over the last several years. But given the economic circumstances, the budgetary circumstances, and the fact that we have, in essence, a government that is split between different parties controlling some of the functions, particularly in the Congress, there are some concerns. Some of the budget recommendations that have come out of the House of Representatives, for instance, would make significant cuts to research budgets, and they would stop the improvement that's happened over the last couple of years in terms of Pell grants that are available for student aid for our most needy students. The next category, state funding for public universities. We are in a better position than a lot of states, but we are still challenged by having state funding for current operations limited. The funding in absolute dollars that we are getting now, coming in this fiscal year, is about on par with what we received when I got here 10 years ago. So taking into account inflation and all other factors that have happened during that time, our buying power has actually decreased. So that is a concern. Again, we are in a better position than many institutions, but that is of real concern. Then the next 2 have to do with external impacts, external environment impacts, macroeconomic uncertainty. That is affecting everyone, the rising interest rates, what is happening in terms of the general economy, and related to that, persisting higher inflation. Inflation has significantly impacted our institution. That comes in the categories of supply costs, for instance, travel costs, benefit costs, even though that our programs are provided by the state, we have to pay the state for many of the positions that get benefits, and those costs have gone up dramatically in the last couple of years. There's the impact of the recent labor settlements. That is important from the standpoint of our employees and their ability to address inflation at their level, but of course comes back to impact us in terms of our costs. The end of federal pandemic aid was a significant impact to us. We got a significant amount of federal aid, much of which went directly into financial aid for students, but much of which allowed us to sustain the university during those very, very lean times when we were challenged by not only COVID-related cost increases, but also significant drop in revenue, such as in housing, dining, and so on. And then finally, the one that concerns me a great deal is net tuition revenue growth before inflation. What does that mean? That means, are we bringing in enough each year more to cover the cost increases that we are facing? And I will point back to increase in personnel costs, increase in fringe benefit costs, financial aid costs, supply costs, utilities, and so on. These are a significant number of pressures. And I think that these are top of mind for me and my colleagues across other institutions in the US as we think about how do we position our universities to sustain over time, to come out of the post-pandemic doldrums, if you will, and sustain ourselves over time. You'll hear later in this talk where we are positioned from our own budget for the current year. We are in the second year of having official deficit budgets as a result of the imbalance between our revenues and our expenses at this point. Although we're making progress to get back into that balance, that's a necessary thing over the next couple of years. I think we have an opportunity for a poll here, something that I would appreciate your thoughts in. I talked about 6 different types of risks that were identified by Moody's. I'd like you now to pick 3 of those that you think, from your perspective, impact Rutgers and consider risks for Rutgers. Let's go with the poll, please. Stephanie, how's that progressing?
Yep, we have about 73% of the participants responding. So I can end the poll.
Okay.
And great, I can end the poll in just 1 second and
Okay.
share the results.
So there's a real balance here. And I think that I appreciate everybody's perspective. Look at the ones that drive to the top: state funding for public universities. Always a concern for this institution. Just as a point of reference, state funding that is available for operations, not for fringe benefit support, but for operations, is about 10% of our budget now. And that's better than a lot of other institutions, but that's a tough position to be in. Persisting high inflation, I think we're going to be facing that for some time. The net tuition revenue growth, that's the one that's most challenging. You may know that for the year that we just started, it was necessary for us to have a extraordinary tuition increase. I hope to position us so that we don't have to have something like that again. So thank you all for your input on that. I think that lines very well with the kinds of things that I'm working on and continuing to monitor as we go forward. So with that, I would like to turn the mic over to our team from procurement, which we'll begin with Maggie Quinn, and she'll introduce her colleague as we talk about procurement policy changes. Maggie?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. As some of you might know, my name is Maggie Quinn. I work here in University Procurement Services as the Director to Procure to Pay Operations. I'd also like to introduce Natalie Mayfield, who is a Continuous Improvement Manager here in UPS. And Natalie was actually instrumental in helping us move these policy changes forward. So next slide, please. There we go. So as some of you may recall, back in 2018, the university revised its procurement and payment policy to align with the procurement methods outlined in the Uniform Guidance, which is the regulatory framework for the acquisition of goods and services using federal funds. In November of 2020, the federal government made updates to the Uniform Guidance. These updates included an increase of the micro purchase threshold up to $50,000, an increase of the formal bid threshold up to $250,000, and a restriction on the use of local preferences for awards using federal funds. And finally, it permitted institutions to self-certify the above thresholds. Next slide, please. So UPS, we made recommendations to our Board of Governors and presented it to them in June. And we're happy to report that the Board of Governors approved our recommendations. The key takeaways are that our single quote threshold was increased from 10,000 to 50,000. The formal bid threshold was increased from 150,000 to 250,000. And guidance to prevent restrictions of competition was also incorporated. There were some other minor revisions unrelated to uniform guidance, which included the elimination of delegation of procurement authority for athletics. The board approval threshold was raised for bid waivers, was raised from 1 million to 5 million. It also incorporated an approval process for bid waivers between 1 million and 5 million for the chief financial officer to approve those. Waiver of bids between 1 and 5, as well as competitive bid awards over 10 million now have reporting requirements. And the board would also requires approval of any formally bid procurement over 10 million. So those are the major takeaways. We hope that that will help create some efficiencies in the procurement, both at the department level as well as at UPS. We think overall this is good news for the university. Are there any questions?
We do not have any questions at this time, but we will have an additional Q&A toward the end of this session, and Maggie and others from procurement services will be available for the Ask the Expert sessions that follow today's town hall. So if you have questions that come to you throughout the rest of today's town hall, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or address them during the Ask the Expert sessions.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie.
Absolutely. And with that, maybe Mike will come back in to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you, Maggie. And these are changes that have been long coming. We're glad to see that the federal government has loosened up some of the requirements to allow us to make things easier for purchasing while still maintaining appropriate controls and appropriate compliance. So look forward to seeing how that helps the organization. Next, want to introduce Doug Orr. Doug is our new Chief Audit Executive, having come here from Vanderbilt University most recently. But as I mentioned earlier, he's returning to Rutgers. He's returned to Rutgers after some time away, and we're very pleased to have him join us today to talk about what's going on in his mind and as we look at different risks and opportunities for the university. Doug?
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it. And next slide, please, if you would, Max. Yeah, one more. Thanks. This is just a quick line of detail on where I've spent my career path. As Mike noted, I started here at Rutgers back in 1988. For those of you who have been here for over 20 years, our paths have probably crossed, and if we haven't, then I look forward to meeting y'all. Probably won't take very long for the numbers people on this call to calculate that this is my 40th year in internal auditing. The last 35 of which have been in higher ed, and those have, of course, been my best years. Next slide, please. For those of you, this might be a reminder to some, but information to others. Just a quick hit on how we report. Administratively, internal audit and advisory services reports up to Vice President Honig, our Chief Compliance Officer. But functionally, we actually report to the Committee on Audit of the board. This particular relationship is what enables us to be independent. It's what gives us our authority and our purpose. Super important, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. The other thing I'd like you to take away from this slide is that of the 5 individuals you see organizationally here, Rachel down through my management team, 4 of them have assumed those positions in the past year, including our vice president, which not only presents some great challenges, but some also awesome opportunities, and we'll speak to those in a little bit. Next slide, please. This is as I noted, we report to the Board of Governors Committee on Audit. This is just excerpts from our charter, which shows you our authority and our purpose, and just that was more for informational purposes for anyone that might be interested in that. Next slide, please. Our vision, a new vision, just slightly tweaked, but an important change. I truly do see this office as a change agent, a catalyst for change, if you will. I truly believe that management should use us to its ability, primarily to not only control risks, which everybody knows that's what audit is here to help, but really to improve efficiencies and find opportunities to overcome the issues that Mike just related to us, the trends in higher education, whether they be the net revenue over expenses issues, or helping promoting state funding, whatever those might be. I truly think that we can serve as a change agent and help management seek those opportunities and find those opportunities. Next slide, please. It's ironic, what are internal auditing's objectives? It's ironic when we learn, when you're taking the certification exam for internal audit, that they start with the word scare as the acronym, and then they wonder why everybody is so hesitant to have auditors in their shop. Over my lifetime, my experience, we take the S and throw it at the end and make it cares, because we truly are a more proactive and a more collaborative and partnering office these days. And these are objectives, and these are the objectives. One of these centralized objectives is pretty much what every audit should cover, or at least a piece of this. The most important being the A in there, the accomplishment of objectives. All the rest kind of revolve around that. We seek to make sure that we are achieving our objectives, whether they be unit-wide, whether they be division-wide, whether they be entity-wide. And that all relates to our goal and the objectives when we set out to do an audit. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? Auditing is not just when we choose audits, it's not a lottery, it's not a lottery pick, it's not a random event. This is a small representation of Rutgers audit universe. Everybody knows it's a big place, maybe bigger than most people realize. What you see on this screen represents, give or take, conservatively 2,800 auditable entities at the university. We're a staff of 16, so it's a lot of audit coverage, and we do cover all 4 divisions, all 4 chancellor units, as well as central administrative units. And it's a complex process that we go through to determine how we get those audits and how we come out to see you all. Next slide, please. And this is a little bit about how that looks like. Over the next couple months, a good number of you, as well as senior leadership, will either be getting surveys that we're going to ask you to complete, as well as interviews with some of the leadership, and maybe some of you to clarify answers to those surveys. It's a process that I don't think has been as detailed as it's needed to be in the past. We went through this, I'll say, very intricately back in 1996. I don't think it's been done to that extent since then. But it's really to get an idea of, what are the risks that you all see at the university? Some we can answer very objectively, and we will do so through the survey. Others are subjective based on your particular positions or where you sit within the organization. But we'll send out those surveys. We'll aggregate the data. We'll compare it to prior year data, looking at trends that might similar to the trends that Mike just noted. We'll look at emerging risks in higher education, whether they be coming from the government or just from the external environment in general. We benchmark with our peers, and we have not only the Big Ten, but a whole other group that we identify with singularly as institutions. We'll aggregate all that data. We'll look at our current staffing and the competencies, and then we'll put together a draft of areas that we think we need to look at. Should be noted that as we collect all this information, Mike had shown you the risk intelligent organizations and how enterprise risk management and compliance feed into that. A lot of this survey information will feed into our enterprise risk management as we look at not only individual units risks and how they tie into their divisional risks, but how they tie into the entity as a whole and what the overall emphasis or risks might be. We take that plan, we talk to our senior leadership, we get their input into, do these risks make sense? Do these audits make sense to them? And then we bring that to the audit committee, and the audit committee has to approve our annual plan. And once they've approved that plan, we start work. Next slide, please. For us, as I noted, we have a staff of 16 and a fairly large universe to comprehend. So in order for us to complete that audit plan requires some, grabbing some opportunities of our own within the department. And we've already started a lot of this process, the management team and a lot of our new audit staff, simplifying our own practices, streamlining practices in our own office, standardizing some programs for similar types of audits so we don't have to recreate the wheel every time we go out. Shortening time spent with clients, focusing truly on smaller risk-focused audits. What's important to that department and the achievement of their objectives, and how do we spend, a limited time or less time doing that. Enhancing communications throughout the audit so we can get, in and out and the results out to you and to your leadership more efficiently. And then reworking our audit follow-up process. For those of you who have been involved in audits, that when we do an audit, we have management actions that we recommend, and we follow up to make sure that those are done. And that's part of our professional standards that we have to do that. Next slide, please. Some of those key partnerships that we have as we're going through our audit and allocating our resources. The big circles are those that we work with continuously, specifically University Ethics and Compliance and the Enterprise Risk Management team as well. External audit, we group with them and meet with them annually just to make sure that we're not overlapping audits or areas that we might be looking into. They rely on some of our work. We rely on some of their work on financials so that we don't duplicate efforts. And then those smaller circles in there represent those areas that we still have a close, not as big as the other ones, but close ties to that we work closely with throughout the year on different things. Next. So the IAA, which is the Institute of Internal Auditors and is our professional standards body, came out with this model, and this model is very important for all of you and especially for us as well. But this represents the lines of defense, or the people that are how we manage risk throughout the institution, and whose responsibility is for internal controls at various levels. And you can see by the boxes down at the bottom, that orange box, those first line roles, the predominant number of you on this call are those first line roles. You're the ones that are directly providing services and products to clients. The daily transactions, how we deal with students, how we deal with employees. The second line is those central administrative functions that kind of oversee various areas. They might be the controller's office, it might be human resources, research administration. Those are all areas that have a select or specific expertise, and they kind of monitor to make sure that what you're doing on the first line is working appropriately. That third line is where audit comes in. Internal audit provides that independent review and just kind of make sure that we're all doing what we're supposed to do. But those three lines are significantly important as we look at our respective roles throughout internal control and managing risk. Next slide, please. So this, problem with our slide, that's okay. This cube represents the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, which is a group of 5 different organizations. The Institute of Internal Auditing is one of them. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the 5 organizations, all with management and accounting related responsibilities, who developed this model for enterprise risk management. The top of that cube represents risks, different major categories of risk that the institution might face. Strategic, operational. Reporting is really financial and financial reporting, and then regulatory and compliance. There's a 5th major category, which would be reputational risk, but that is kind of integrated throughout all of the other 4. If you have a problem with one of those, you likely have a reputational risk as well. And you can see, so the front represents the basic categories of internal control, or the primary internal control system that the organization faces. And then on the side of that cube, you see the different levels of the organization, starting at entity level, which would be obviously enterprise-wide or the university-wide. Division and business unit could be the chancellor's divisions and central administration. There might be some business units which rise to that level of structure division, and then subsidiaries might be departments, or maybe even departments within a school. But we look at this in a holistic manner from an enterprise risk standpoint. We talk about audit versus compliance. That you can see that compliance or compliance objectives are covered in one of those strategic objectives or one of those objectives up top. And audit obviously will look and audit central compliance functions and institutional compliance functions, but they really are, while they're different, they're very complementary, and we'll see that as we get into this next slide. Thanks, please. Real quickly, you see that circle on the bottom right-hand corner there represents the elements of a effective compliance system as defined by the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations. And if you work your way around that wheel, starting at the top 1 through 7, that's what those statements relate to in the middle 1 through 7. And you can see how each one of those elements of an effective compliance system match up to elements of an effective internal control system. Policies and procedures, roles and responsibilities, job descriptions, those are all part of the internal control environment. Those match specifically to those first two pieces. Risk assessment, self-explanatory. Standards and controls represent control activities from an internal control system. Training and communication, reporting, information communication, and monitoring and audits. I think the key here is from an internal audit perspective, as we noted back in those 3 levels of defense. Internal audit is the assurance activity. Central compliance or institutional compliance is responsible for assuring that you all meet your compliance requirements. They perform that monitoring function or making sure that everybody's doing the right thing and helping you to do so, whereas audit has to maintain that independence so we can provide proper assurance. So again, similar but different. And that's where, go to the next slide, Max. That's really where I end. Welcome any questions and comments. And I'm not sure that I properly signed up for the question and answer period, but you are all free to send me emails at any time. I'm happy to meet with anyone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Doug. We actually do have a few questions that came in.
Sure.
So the first question is a 2-part question. Will the auditing be specifically around current business practices at the university? How will departments handle their finances, for example? Or will this group be more broad in auditing more human resources practices as well?
Good question. We actually audit soup to nuts. If it has a process, it is auditable. We proactively help. We can help you design new, the advisory services piece of audit and advisory services. We can come in and help a department or an area create the proper controls around business processes. That's part of our advisory service aspect. Otherwise, we can provide assurance reviews, and that's the audit piece of it, on virtually any process, and we do, whether it be, it can be a grade change. It could be a grade change audit in academic areas. We do compliance audits, whether, regulatory compliance work, whether it might be FERPA, HIPAA, uniform guidance, and then also financial controls over business processes.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, with the recent data breach with emails where social security numbers were present, is that an area your organization reviews and audits, like security and access for all systems and emails within Rutgers?
We do. We have an IT team of 4. One of our managers is specific. We have an IT division, I should say, an IT audit division. And we do work very closely with both the Office of Information Technology as well as the Office of Information Security. In fact, information security sits right outside my office. And we do those reviews, and we look at the control processes and the overall processes with which they operate.
Thank you. That's it for now, but additional questions may come in throughout the balance of the meeting, like the one that just popped into the chat. A long time ago, there was a class regarding general auditing and internal controls that new employees could attend to as part of their general training. It was a great class. Do you plan to bring back something similar?
I would happily do that. We were part of there was an entire catalog of courses, business courses that people could take. And actually I was here when those were developed, and I would happily bring those back if people wanted them, and we'll offer them.
All right, we have another question, Doug. Considering that Rutgers has a vast audit universe, as you stated, 2,800 auditable areas, and with a manning of 16, how do you cover all of these areas? What is the audit frequency? So basically, how do you cover all of the audit universe?
Well, the short answer is we obviously don't in a year. And that's why university-wide risk assessment is so important, is so that we can take those, allocate those scarce resources and allocate them correctly. We will be doing more reviews a year. That's part of that streamlining of our processes and having smaller, more risk-focused audits, so we can actually complete more reviews a year and get to more areas. But it's all about risk assessment and determining where the greatest risks lie and how we can best add value to the university.
Okay, great. Looks like that is it for now. Again, if you have additional questions, please submit them. Another one just popped in. So we'll take this question as well. When does internal audit come to review new processes or departments for risk, compliance, and operations, like HR OneSource, one-stop student centers, and the new tuition database?
Depending on where they fall within, risk tolerance, and if we're aware that we have new processes. Again, we can't be aware of everything, but that's what this annual risk assessment will help us find. And so we're going to go through a major risk assessment. I noted a major risk assessment this year, but annually we will do follow-ups to see what's changed and where things may have moved up, down in terms of priority.
All right, thank you. If any additional questions come in, we will have another Q&A segment at the end of today's town hall, and we can raise those questions then. Thank you, Doug. And with that, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you, Doug. And we are very, very glad, very fortunate to have you come back to Rutgers. You bring a tremendous amount of value, new perspectives to us. So thanks for that. And as Stephanie said, any questions for any of the participants today, for myself, for Doug, for Maggie, or David, who's coming forward in a moment, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will address them in the Q&A session after David's. So now I'd like to introduce David Moore, our Vice President for Financial Planning and Analytics and Chief Budget Officer. This is a recent promotion for David, and very worthy of it. And we're very glad to have him with us. He's going to give an overview of the fiscal 24 budget, in essence, what the Board of Governors saw as we were reviewing it earlier this summer. So David, over to you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Next slide, please. Great. The FY24 budget reflects the values of Rutgers University in fulfilling its core priorities of teaching, research, service, and patient care. The budget reflects the statement of our priorities while taking steps to preserve access and affordability for our students. Let's go to the next slide, please. The FY24 budget will spend approximately $5.4 billion on the things that are most important to us. When you look at the chart here, we see 77% is spent on our core missions of student instruction, research, public service, and patient care. 15% is spent on operations and maintenance for our facilities and sports administration. 5% is spent on auxiliary enterprises, which primarily includes housing, dining, and parking operations. And 3% is spent on athletics. And we'll go a little bit deeper into these areas in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So now let's explore some of the categories for a deeper understanding. The core mission are made up of classroom instructions and academic support, which makes up 1/3 of the total budget. This includes faculty compensation, staff support for academic units, libraries, dean's offices, and this makes up 33% of the overall budget, or $1.77 billion. This budget strives to support and advance Rutgers' high-quality instruction and academic excellence. Student scholarships, financial aid, public service, and extension and public and patient care comprises 32% of the budget, which is a total of about 1.69% or 69 billion. This budget preserves and increases investment in student financial aid funding. In addition, when we look at this particular portion of the budget, it supports social and cultural events for students, the agricultural extension programs, delivery of healthcare, support of health clinics, and community services provided throughout the state. Sponsored research and other sponsored programs makes up 12% of the budget. This includes funds spent on research and activities associated with federal, state, and non-governmental grant contracts. Together, these items represents the core missions of the student instruction, research, public service, and patient care, and together they add up to about 4.1 billion, or 77% of the total budget. Let's go to the next slide, please. As we round out the budget for the remaining 23% of the annual budget includes administration and operation, which includes support for central administrative offices such as research administration, finance, human resources, procurement, legal, to name a few, as well as supports Rutgers facilities. This includes all Rutgers buildings, and it includes costs like insurance, fuel, upkeep, and utility costs, which accounts for slightly over 15% of the total annual budget. Auxiliary enterprises, again, this includes housing at all Rutgers campuses. It also includes dining contracts and services and operations, as well as parking operations. This accounts for approximately 5% of the annual expense budget. Athletics, which includes the 24 men's and women's Division I sports programs at Rutgers, New Brunswick, accounts for approximately 3% of the annual budget. It is important to note that of this 3%, approximately 3/4 of the athletics budget is supported through funds generated by the athletic program. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as we were developing the FY24 financial plan, there were a number of upward pressures on costs. Some of those are noted here: student support and financial aid, salary increases, which was noted earlier, as well as rising cost for just non-personnel type activity. This would include inflationary increases in utilities, commodities, and categories such as supplies, travel, contractual, professional services, but also too, again, in the premiums and pension contributions in our fringe benefits. Next slide. So now let's look at kind of where the funds come from. Approximately 27.4% of our revenues come from tuition and fees that are charged. Just over 21% of the university's revenues comes from the state of New Jersey, some in unrestricted operating support that supports the core missions and operational costs, and a portion that covers the cost of fringe benefits for some of our employees. The next category, patient care services, includes revenues from governmental payers, private insurers, and affiliated agreements for patient care services, which accounts for approximately 20.8%. And jumping over to sponsored research, which includes grants and contracts from federal, state, and non-governmental entities, makes up approximately 15.1% of the overall total revenue. Rounding out the overall sources of revenues is miscellaneous sources. This would include student, federal, and state aid, auxiliary enterprises, athletics, gifts and contributions, as well as endowment and investment income. And that's approximately 15.3% of the overall revenues. Next slide, please. So let's turn to tuition fees and financial aid. Next slide. The budget for FY 2024 included a 6% increase for tuition and mandatory fees for most undergraduate and graduate programs. How that looks is for a typical undergraduate arts and science student who is a New Jersey resident, so in-state student, that will roughly average to $387 for tuition and $100 for mandatory student fees per semester. For students choosing to live on campus, room, board, and residential educational fees will increase based on the type of room or meal plan that is selected. Next slide. We put a high priority on keeping Rutgers affordable by providing our students with institutional student aid, qualifying state and federal aid, and as well as grant programs. There are many ways that Rutgers students and their families are able to reduce out-of-pocket costs based on prior year data. We know that 4 out of 5 of our undergraduate students receiving aid have some form of aid that they receive. Next slide. As we look at what Rutgers is doing to preserve and improve access and affordability, we can look at the institutional financial aid that is offered to New Jersey residents. There's the Scarlet Guarantee Program at Rutgers New Brunswick, Run to the Top program at Rutgers Newark, Bridge the Gap program at Rutgers Camden. These programs all are complemented by the state of New Jersey's Garden State Guarantee Program, a new program that started this past year. And these programs were designed to make college more accessible, affordable by offering the last dollar financial aid for students. These are fantastic financial aid programs for our students so they can help with the cost of education. Next slide. Also, we see improvement as we look at our state and federal financial aid levels. Where in FY24, the Garden State Guarantee, so the new budget that was approved by the legislature and governor, the Garden State Guarantee will start to mirror the 3 programs designed by Rutgers by adding a 3rd tier to its program. In addition, FY24, under the new budget that was passed, the New Jersey Tuition Aid Grant, or referred to as TAG funding, will see an increase after a number of years where the funding had remained flat for many years. Further on the federal level side, and this again has seen a great increase for our Pell Grants, where some indications could support more increases in the federal fiscal year 24. These are critical financial aid programs coupled with those provided by Rutgers through our institutional aid, and it helps our students overall. Can we go to the next slide? As we look toward future financial plans, we will need to focus our efforts to maximize our opportunities and plan for challenges that we will all face together. This slide provides just a few of those opportunities and challenges. As Mike Gower shared, the FY 2024 budget is the 2nd year of a deficit budget at approximately $77 million. We hope that we can bring some of that deficit down as we work throughout the year. That said, as we work on future financial plans and balancing our resources with expenses, we will work together to face opportunities and challenges by maximizing opportunities and minimizing the challenges through planning. Next slide. So now let's turn to FY 2025. So we always finish a year and we start planning for the next year, which is really good because it's continuous planning. Next slide. give you just a little bit of an overview of the Rutgers budget and planning calendar. We start with the months of July through December. During this time, guidance is provided by the University Budget Office to campuses and support units as they start to develop unit budgets. The proposed changes are collected, reviewed, and discussed in various committees. As we move into the early winter and through spring, schools, centers, and institutes are developing their budgets and meeting with their respective chancellor offices. After those budgets are developed, they are consolidated to one total university budget and prepared for presentation to the Board of Governors. Next slide. We coupled that with following also to the state of New Jersey budget calendar. During the months of July through approximately February and March, the governor and the Office of Budget and Management, OMB, reviews the administration's priorities. Updates are made to economic forecasts for revenue estimates that will support the state's annual long-term financial obligations. In addition to requests for budget initiatives and additional resources are sent to all state agencies to fill out and return to the state. During this time, and so it's during this particular time period, we'll be developing our New Jersey State Budget Initiative forms to request additional resources. These requests, along with revenue projections and requests from other agencies for additional resources, are reviewed and proposed budget from the governor and administration is developed. And this is presented to the state legislature by early spring. The proposed budget moves into budget deliberations. So it's kind of in that February through June timeframe. And this is reviewed by both the Senate and the General Assembly. After the legislative process moves through, the budget bill will move into its final phases and be presented back to the governor after both legislative houses approves a budget bill. Governor then can either sign the proposed bill or can veto certain items. And then during the month of June, the state agencies learn of the final budget that will follow the fiscal year. So we do track both of these, not only the state process, but also to how it mirrors to our and complements our process here at the university. Next slide. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions that come up, and also to, after the overall presentation, be happy to take any questions. Stephanie, thank you.
So we do have a few questions that are in right now, starting with how does the percentage of spending in these categories compare to our Big Ten colleagues? This was at the start of your presentation.
Right. We do compare to the Big Ten. Every institution is a little bit different, made up differently. We certainly are in, when we look at some of the data that's available to us in these spending categories. So mainly there's some areas or some information that comes from iPads for one, but what we see is that we are in good company with some of the Big Ten colleagues in terms of comparability. Not a whole lot of difference in different categories, but again, each campus, each university is made up differently. So expenses are kind of in sometimes different categories. But when we look at our main categories like instruction and the core missions, we do see a lot of similarities.
Thank you. Our next question is, at the medical school, after the merger with Barnabas, we're not sure what our fiscal year is. Is it still the academic year or calendar year as Barnabas? Currently, a lot of time is being spent to conduct analysis twice, once for fiscal year and then for the calendar year.
Can't speak for Barnabas, but what I can speak for is the university, and we follow a July 1st through June 30th fiscal year.
Is Rutgers doing anything to lobby the state about the fringe charges? They are astronomically high.
It's been a lot of effort to work with the state, the legislature, the governor, the administration to recognize the increase not only in the fringe cost, but really the kind of the two drivers, which is healthcare premiums and pension funding for the pension. And we were a few years ago successful in getting some relief. That continues to be a strong, there continues to be strong advocacy for that. And that relief has actually helped us in terms of overall bringing the rates down for our federal contracts and grants. More can be found on the sponsored research websites, and we can provide that at the end of this.
Our next question is, how often are cost pools reviewed in terms of accuracy and propriety of charges to all schools and units? And who is involved in this review process?
Each year we do update our data based on the, whether it be student headcount driven, whether it be staff or faculty headcount, based on the statistics that go into distributing the cost of the support centers or support units. These are reviewed not only by my office, but also by the budget committee in terms of the overall RCM allocation. And again, through the RCM tool is allocating the cost. That also is reviewed at the chancellor levels as well.
Great, thank you, David. That is it. Those are all the questions that we have right now. Mike, if you are ready to open for the full Q&A, then we can do that.
Yes, let's go ahead with that. And if you have questions for any of the speakers today, please submit them to the Q&A function or in the chat. Stephanie.
All right. So a question for Doug. Do you involve the auditees in your annual risk assessment? Maybe I'll give Doug a minute to come back on camera. Great.
So obviously we don't reach out to every potential auditee. That would take years to review. We do go through the major areas. So chances are better not if it's not a specific auditee. It might be a next level up from them, like a business office manager. We do try to hit all of the major units. We try to get to every school, obviously every central administrative unit, and involve them and get some feedback in that process. We don't know who the actual auditees are going to be in any given year. So it's a general university-wide assessment, and the auditees are selected from that.
Thank you. How much time is given for units to prepare for an audit?
That's a good question. Sometimes they are not aware. In the past, I know they have not been aware. This year, we will be letting all of senior leaders know potential audits in their area, and we would expect the leaders to pass that information down to their direct reports and let those people know that there's a potential for that there may be a review in that audit in their area.
The next question came in, Doug, during your presentation, but I think it probably applies a little bit more broadly. The question is, do online classes and work from home in any way help reduce costs?
I'll take that, Stephanie. Not really. And there are online classes, you might find over time some reduction in cost in terms of use of space, but the likelihood is that it won't grow to a level that makes a difference in terms of our cost structure. Work from home has the potential as well. In a hybrid format, however, it will take some time for us to really think through how could we reorganize space to utilize it better, utilize less space, perhaps. by staggering the work from home schedules in such a way that we don't have everybody in the entire group in the same days as we do presently at 33 Knightsbridge. So over time, perhaps that could help, but initially not really.
The next question is for Maggie. For the single quote threshold, which is now increased from 10,000 to 50,000, will this affect the supporting documentation that's required in Marketplace?
Hi, Stephanie. It will only affect it insofar as you only need the one quote for any purchases up to 50,000. If it's a specialty type of purchase, like professional services, all the additional documentation, including a scope of work form or an iced form, if that was applicable, that would still be required.
Thank you. Back to David. A follow-up to the fringe question. The relief does not apply to research funded sponsored by industry, which is disproportionately and adversely affecting those researchers who work routinely with industry. Is there a plan to secure relief for industry-sponsored grants and contracts?
I'll take this, David, since it relates to the state. The relief that was provided for fringe was through an appropriation by the state legislature. And that appropriation was specifically limited to federal direct sponsored or federal pass-through funds for sponsored research. So we did not have a choice in terms of how to apply it. We could apply it only as an offset against the fringe costs for those activities. There are some efforts within the legislature to look at the fringe rates more broadly, to look at the disproportionately high piece that we are paying as higher education into the retirement category. We pay significantly more than the costs that we have, and there's just the difference between the PERS plans and the defined contribution plans that most higher education employees have access to. That's one initiative. It has actually passed the Senate, did not pass the House. There's some opposition by the administration. That's something that we can continue to push on as a lobbying effort. And there's also the opportunity for the legislature to appropriate funds more broadly and not just to support federal research. But again, that is something that has to be done through the governmental process. We will certainly make the appropriate parties in the state aware of these impacts, but that's the challenge that we face with this. I'll take the next two since they relate to fringe as well. It says, has the FY23 fringe rate been finalized with the state? It has not, but we have made it clear to the state that we are not going to reopen any grants relative to addressing a retroactive payment from that. There's just no way that we can do that. Many of those grants are closed. Their budget periods are closed. There's no way to reopen them. We're going to do as we did in fiscal 22 and not reopen those, not make those retroactively applied. Now, going forward, however, we were able to change the way that we do fringe benefits vis-a-vis the federal government. It's not only the state that's involved. The federal government has to approve fringe benefit rates. And so we have switched to a Rutgers-specific fringe rate that does take into account that we make reimbursements to the state, but actually allows us to negotiate a separate rate with the federal government and make it applicable for the entire fiscal year. You may know that we were able to bring forward fringe rates as of July 1 that are approved and applicable for the full fiscal year. We will continue to do that. There'll be some risks and some challenges in terms of that. We still have to pay back the state from proceeds that we recover through the billing of sponsors. But nonetheless, we will be staying with this. This year, because of the switch, it got approved very late in June. I would expect in future years we'll be on a more reasonable cycle, which means somewhere in the neighborhood of April or so that we will get the approvals from the federal government.
Thank you. Our next question is, since the RCM process allocates tuition on a 75-25 basis, why doesn't the RCM process allocate financial aid on the same basis?
So thank you, Stephanie. The tuition or the revenue side is really connected, and really the expense side is connected to how it represents how it comes in. So from a tuition standpoint, it looks at the courses that are being taken and the revenue that's coming in that directly then offsets the cost for that cost of education. When we get into financial aid, when we look at metrics, we're looking at more of a student metric, and that is more appropriate of a way of allocating that cost. So you have an expense versus a revenue situation or question here, but the expense side is more appropriate to look at the student and type of student. So undergraduate, graduate, and also to rather in-state or out-of-state. So those are things that are taken into consideration, but more so just that the cost is more aligned with the distribution. The revenue is aligned with where the expenses are to provide that service, which is 75% to where the instruction happens and 25 to where they are enrolled, so that there's appropriate coverage for things like instructors' costs and providing the course, and also to then on the 25% side, covering costs like advising and so forth.
Our next question is, could more data be shared around the RCM metrics so that units have a better understanding of their costs? It is hard to assess costs when some of the metrics are blended, or we do not understand how decisions were made to determine the proportion of the drivers of the metrics. Many of my colleagues cannot properly assess what we are paying.
So thank you, great question. And we continue to educate our campus community and work on updating our educational materials. I'd be happy to have any questions that you want to send me after. But certainly working with the chief business officers at each campus, along with the chancellor offices and the related schools at each campus, to help with that education and to understand the metrics through the RCM tool.
Thank you. Mike, I'm going to come back to you for a question that was related to your talk on trends in higher ed. Dr. Clayton Christensen's ideas about disruptive innovation as applied to higher education bring up potential risks and challenges to universities. How is Rutgers positioning itself to mitigate those risks?
That's an excellent question, and thank you, whoever submitted that. I have had the opportunity to see Dr. Christensen a couple of times over my career, and I read his book relative to higher education, and I think that his thoughts are very, very applicable right now. Our industry is being disrupted in a way that is not unlike potentially what happened in the newspaper industry, what's happened multiple times in healthcare, and other industries where the basic premises around what we are here to do are questioned. I think that's shown also in numerous studies relative to public belief or public trust in higher education. Rutgers is a very special institution insofar as it has a very broad mission of support for state, for the people of the state, for really the country in terms of education, but also research, public service, healthcare. And each of those missions is potentially challenged right now. It could be challenged in terms of education. For instance, the traditional college-age students numbers are changing. The profiles of those are changing. What does education mean? What does higher education need to be? How do we think about adult learners? How do we think about other needs in terms of education as we go forward? Research is a challenging area insofar as it is really, really important for the advancement of society, for solving problems, for curing diseases. It is hugely important, but research in its nature requires subsidization. We never recover the full cost of research from any sponsor. And then the healthcare areas and the public service areas are similarly challenged. I think we have to be bold at this time and think about what does the next Rutgers look like? What does the future Rutgers look like? What do these missions mean in terms of the next several decades? How will we look beyond the traditional college populations? How will we look at needs of industry? How will we look at needs of employers in terms of what kinds of programs do we offer to potential students? How do we make ourselves inviting? How do we make ourselves continue to be as affordable as possible? How do we conduct the best possible research? How do we make this all work while having a fit model that is financially sustainable? That is tremendously challenging, as David indicated, and as I mentioned before. We're in the second year of a deficit budget coming out of the pandemic. We obviously can't sit a deficit every year. We have to get back into balance, but then past that, we have to get in a position where we have funds to reinvest. So we actually have to run surpluses at some point so that we have capital to reinvest in facilities, in programs, in people. I heard something interesting at a recent program I went to. It was a college president who said, nonprofit is a tax status, not a higher education strategy. We must have funds to be able to reinvest. That doesn't mean that we can perpetually raise our price either, though. The elasticity around tuition increases is long gone. And I think that we have to be much more moderate in that going forward. So I am convinced that Dr. Christensen's basic premise that we have to be innovative in a disruptive manner is what is necessary for this institution in the next couple of years. And I'll be working very hard with the academic leadership, the president, the chancellors, the executive vice president for academic affairs, my other colleagues in the cabinet, in order to position ourselves in a way that not just allows Rutgers to survive, but allows Rutgers to sustain itself and grow and continue to serve the way that we have for so many years.
Thank you. Will the budget model that you just referred to operate in a surplus apply to athletics as well?
We will see, and I'm hesitant to be declarative about that because the declarations about athletics have been used in a variety of ways over time. Athletics is a front door to the institution. As President Holloway has said, it's the only avenue for which 40,000 people can come to the institution on a given day and participate in something that the institution is doing besides Records Day. I said that's the other the other good opportunity. We also have to understand what the realignment of college conferences is going to mean in terms of economics. But there are a lot of challenges in athletics. There are costs that are being thrust upon us by the NCAA, for instance, some of which are directly supporting student athletes in terms of their well-being and nutrition, some of which are things that I would call unfunded mandates. So every time we try to make some headway in terms of reducing the subsidy that's necessary for athletics, we get other things thrown at us. But I can guarantee you that I am working very hard with athletics to try to position it in the right place. But again, we are going to have to see what these realignments in college athletics are going to do in general and to Rutgers specific.
So Mike, I think we have time for one more question to answer live. The remaining questions we will have answered and included the follow-up communications after today's town hall. The last question that we'll raise is there a main driver of the deficit?
I think David and I could tag team on this one a bit. Yes. So I would say the primary driver, well, actually there are two. There are two drivers that have resulted in the deficit. One is inflation, specifically and generally. Coming out of COVID, our costs increased significantly, not only to address COVID itself, but then the impact of the general inflation overall. Utilities, as I mentioned before, compensation certainly, which is important for us as employees, but has to get paid for. The fringe benefit costs that I referred to earlier. Those things were and continue to be very impactful on that bottom line. The other impact was in terms of enrollment. We had a net reduction of enrollment between the beginning of the pandemic and the year coming out of it, the year that just ended. We had a significantly reduced number of transfer students, primarily because of reduction of enrollment in the county colleges. That amounted to 1,800 students, I believe, David, across the entire institution. We had a significant reduction from pre-COVID to post-COVID in terms of number of international students or out-of-state students. International and out-of-state students pay more per head, and that impacted the revenue side. So those things were directly contributing to that. During COVID, we had support from the federal government that was helping basically to prop up the university, in addition to providing direct financial aid to students. And we planned for it to go away. we planned for that time to come. We took the opportunity to really assess our reserves and position ourselves to be able to move in a deliberative fashion back into balance. So that's why we have this multiple years in deficit budget, actually anticipated. We began talking about this significantly before the first deficit budget was approved, that this would be coming. And how do we address it now? We address things through trying to get ourselves better positioned in terms of enrollment going forward. That could be getting back to where we were, getting in a better position, looking for alternative programs, new ways of attracting students, new students that will be coming in, will pay for an educational program that's important to them, and controlling our costs. We have made a significant impact in terms of cost control the year that we're in right now relative to central administrative units and central units in the chancellor areas. Real net reductions of costs over year to year, including in our division, that matter in terms of reducing that bottom line. But we'll have to continue to look for any opportunity to save money. And at this point, I'm going to give a shameless plug for a program that's coming back, if you will, very shortly. Many of you will recall the discretionary spending program that was introduced during COVID. We are getting ready to roll back out discretionary spend to tools and orientation and information that you all can use as budget officers to control costs wherever possible. Primarily, this is through having appropriate information available to you, but also the ability to look at costs before they are committed. So keep your eyes open for a refresher program on discretionary spending. That's something that we all have to be very, very conscious of. David, anything you want to add to that?
So nothing to add directly to you covered exactly in terms of what was the drivers for the deficit, but I would say coming out of the deficit, something we've talked about is the fact of really this is going to be efforts on both the expense side, but also to the revenue side in terms of additional growth, diversification for revenues in a way that we look toward the future.
I think that's a very good point. And I'm going to close this part of the program by reaffirming that. There's an old expression that I think is really important that says one cannot cut yourself to greatness. You cannot reach greatness by cutting alone. We need to control expenses, yes. Most importantly, we need to grow revenues. And growing revenues comes through programs, through attracting students, through innovative activities, through non-traditional revenues. Those are the things that are necessary for us to really position ourselves well for the future. And with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists, David, Doug, Maggie. I really appreciate you all contributing to this town hall today. There will be information coming along in terms of how do you access the slides from this program, as well as a recording of that. We will also be wanting to get feedback. There is a survey link in the chat I would hope that you would use. And there's also in the chat a flyer for the Ask the Expert sessions that immediately follow after here. We'll leave the chat open for a few minutes here so everybody can access that. We had the largest population audience here for an August program, well over 400. Really appreciate you all spending time with us. I hope this was helpful. And with that, I think we will close the program. We'll leave it open so that you can access ask the experts for a few minutes. But with that, we'll go offline. Thank you all.